Yeah, I'm here to get it. I got drive, got sight, always have a vision. I go by the night, I be in my feelings. I'm a big I need time, and I'll still be winning. I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. From the heathens, got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. I want to hear that one more time. Can you hear it? I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. I got eyes in the back of my head, I'm seeing. Take me for granted, and you know I'm leaving. I'ma take what's mine with the webs I'm weaving. I could take this crap from seeing to believing. Got a taste for blood, and my tongue keeps bleeding from the words I spit. So sharp, so freezing, so cold. Behold, frostbite, they feeling. I could tear you apart, or I could go heal them. Don't believe in fate, don't believe in ceilings. I just need it, taste in my mind starts feeling. I don't pace myself, I grind on kneeling. Got lust for change, I just love the feeling. I ain't gonna give up. Got too little time, I'ma live up. Head down, push forward through tough times. Anything worth doing is a tough climb. I ain't gonna give up. Got too little time, I'ma live up. Head down, push forward through the tough times. Anything worth doing is a tough climb. Cause I'm a live life for the fight, yeah, I'm here to get it. I got drive, got sight, always have a vision. I go by at night, I be in my feelings. I'm a big I need time, and I'll still be winning. I live life for the fight, yeah, I'm here to get it. I got drive, got sight, always have a vision. I go by at night, I be in my feelings. I'm a big I need time, and I'll still be winning. I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. From the heathens, got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. Hello. How is everybody? Can you hear? Let me get over here to my secondary screen. Where are we at? There we are. Okay, I'm seeing thumbs up. Does that mean you can hear? Let me make sure I'm not behind over here. Okay, I'm seeing. Uh-oh. Power off. Power off. Loud and clear, Poppy Red Mustang says. Let me get a sip of water. Our guest, Mark McDonald from Baltimore, Maryland, will be joining us at 1 o'clock. I wanted to start a little bit early just to touch base with everybody, say hi to chat, and lay a little bit of groundwork here. I haven't even sent him the link yet. I'm not sure how long the links last. So Mark, if you're watching, I'll be sending you the link by email about minutes till 1. I don't know. I think they expire, but I don't know. Fizzle, do you know, honey? I see you here in chat. You've done this. If I send Mark his link now, is it going to expire before 1 o'clock? Well, first of all, hi, I'm Susan. Welcome to Lip Locked No More. They last for the whole string. Thank you, Fizzle. Okay. Then I'll send it to him here after I say howdy and whatnot. Stream of consciousness speaker here.
And I've been thinking about, of course, how am I going to intro this? And I come up short. So let me say this. It's no secret to my regular viewing audience that for 8 years, I was a Jehovah's Witness. Very active, good standing. Most of the terminology used within that organization will feel, sound, and be foreign to you, because Jehovah's Witnesses, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania and New York, where the world headquarters are, is not a church. It's a cult that represents itself to the naive, the unwary, the uninformed, will represent itself through religion and the Bible to those who don't know better. You think it's a church. Okay, it's not. I was drawn into the cult during a time of emotional distress, which is their favorite target, those under emotional distress. In my particular case, it was emotional distress created by my sister's death. Without going into a great deal of detail, and we can talk about my involvement some other time. I'm just trying to lay a little bit of something here. Having been given the promise from their rewritten Bible that all would be well, I became an avid student, a very, very good student. And sort of a, if you will, golden-haired child within the local congregation. So I got invited to a lot of social events at other witnesses' homes. Elders, the most important ones, all men, of course, within your congregation, you know, the folks that you want to be seen with. In the course of the 8 years that I was involved in the cult, I came to know one of our elders quite well. His name was Roderick Watkins. He was charismatic, handsome by most standards, extremely well-spoken, and a pedophile. My audience knows that I am a survivor of child sexual abuse. So when I was informed by another congregation member that Roderick Watkins, the most highly esteemed former Bethelite, which I know will mean nothing to most of you, maybe all of you, y'all, this is very triggering for me, okay? See, not only is it triggering because of the child sexual abuse, it's triggering because I escaped the cult July the 1st of 2020. And this is triggering from the CSA standpoint, as well as the having escaped a religious cult standpoint. So I'll be taking several deep breaths, and I've already let Mark know that pretty much when he comes up, I will let him, I want him to bear the burden of most of what is said. Okay. The evening I was informed by my friend that Elder Roderick Watkins had been disfellowshipped and was no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses, I was shocked. And when you are disfellowshipped as a Jehovah's Witness, or when you take the action I took, which is to write a letter of disassociation in order to get them to leave you alone, which takes even more effort after the letter. It is only announced from the podium within the Kingdom Hall at the following midweek meeting, generally speaking, so-and-so is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses, full stop. If it involves child sexual abuse, it most certainly is. So Scott can still see me. I'm okay. I just went black on my end. I hope I'm still here. Where was I? That kind of freaked me out when the screen went black. Am I still here? Okay. Because within the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, also known as Jehovah's Witnesses, child sexual abuse is not reported to authorities. It is dealt with and contained and managed within the organization. A child in our congregation, a young boy, elementary school age, had gone to, I'm not going to go through all the details, but he had gone to his mother, the wife of another elder, under a certain set of stressful circumstances for the child, and reported to her that Roderick Watkins had been touching him inappropriately. The mother called police, resulting in her husband, who was an elder, being removed as an elder in our congregation because you're not allowed to call the police. And as a husband, he failed to maintain control of his household. By Jehovah's Witnesses standards, they were my friends, and I loved them, and I missed them. One thing led to another. Roderick Watkins ended up being arrested and charged with 4 counts of child sexual abuse. Those are the 4 that our district attorney knew they could get a conviction on. But Roderick Watkins sexually molested, to the best of my personal knowledge, 10 children in our congregation. And it was covered up, concealed. But the world headquarters and the governing body in New York received the blue envelopes, the secret blue envelopes that tell the mailroom clerk at world headquarters in New York, the contents within are not for your eyes. They are designated for a certain area where they'll be entered into the secret database, along with the tens of thousands of other names of child sexual abusers within the Jehovah's Witness organization. I attended every moment of the trial of Roderick Watkins, which was held as the crow flies, about 3 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. In that courtroom, a young man, young by my standards, whose face I was unfamiliar with, was seated in the back row. I came to learn later on his name is Mark O'Donnell, a former Jehovah's Witness, a journalist who, since he left the Borg, has worked tooth and nail to expose and bring the facts through his reporting and his coverage of trials of those within the Jehovah's Witness organization, both male and female, accused and most convicted of child sexual abuse. Roderick Watkins was so bold that he would molest children in the same room with other witnesses, including the parents of the little girls. So, Mark has agreed to come on my channel and discuss with my audience the prolific child sexual abuse within the Jehovah's Witness organization. He has a tight schedule, and so we're only going to have Mark for about an hour, and I need to send him that link. um, will ask him to, well, he already knows, and he knows me because we're friends. Long distance friends, granted. He's in Baltimore and I'm in Arkansas. But he and I met that day, the first day of Roderick Watkins' trial. And within months, I was a free woman again. And Mark and his wife, who is also a former Jehovah's Witness and suffered her own abuse, well, they were instrumental in giving me the support emotionally that I needed to fight my way through the cognitive dissonance that is the result of escaping a religious cult. And now, almost 3 years later, this is the first time I've been triggered by Jehovah's Witness talk in a long time. But what I was going to say before I digress there, I let Mark know last night through text, because he's kind of like me. He at least likes to, what should I expect here? I just asked him to give us a little introduction about himself, speak with us briefly regarding his work as a journalist, and to talk about the industrial level of child sexual abuse within the Jehovah's Witness organization from his point of view. The fellow who has probably, and he can correct me, and he will, I'm sure, but has probably covered more trials of Jehovah's Witnesses in this regard than anyone else in the world. So let me go ahead and see if I can do this. I'm really nervous about it. Okay. Mark, if you're watching, I'm about to send you the link, and I'm very, very nervous. Viewers, you know that in the almost 2 years of Lip Locked No More on YouTube, we've only had 2 guests on here, and only one of them was pre-planned. So let's see. How do I? There he is. Okay. Mark, if you're watching, darling, I'm about to send you a link. It says message sent. Oh, thanks for the trigger warnings. Thank you to the mods for being here. Hi, Millie R.N. and Aurora, Mary Martins, Carrie Bishop, Valerie Ventura. Valerie, it does seem like it, doesn't it? Valerie Ventura saying, it seems like pretty much everyone I've met or know, all of them, have been messed with sexually as a child. It's really friggin' sad. This includes myself as well, Valerie says. Yep. According to the United States Department of Justice, hi AC, 1 out of 6 females, 1 out of 4 males in the United States of America will indeed encounter some form of sexual abuse before the age of 18. And it's Hi, John McKinney. Who's your better half, dear? Hi, Sassy Brenda. So I don't have, Mark hasn't grabbed the link yet. At least he hasn't popped up yet. So I do have a couple of pages that I can share with you. I'm sure he'll be here. It's not 1 o'clock yet. It's a few minutes till. I appeared and I've shared on my community tab a couple of times with the passage of time. My appearance on the Lloyd Evans channel on YouTube, my interview with him regarding my escaping the cult. And I think it's about an hour long. And we touch on a lot of the details that I didn't share here. But I didn't put it in the description below. Hi, Crystal Nicole. Hi, Joy Cowley. And Joy, you have your ranch back. I don't know what happened, you guys. You know, in our last live stream, Joy came in and she asked in live chat if she was in trouble. Kimmy, love, you're okay. And I thought she was like just joking around with somebody else in live chat. And I didn't notice, that she wasn't blue. Let me see. Add to stream.
Susan.
Can you hear me, dear?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can't hear you. How do I
Okay.
hear you?
Okay. Let's check.
How do
Audio.
I hear you?
Testing. Microphone works.
Hang on. If I turn up.
Hello. Testing. Microphone works.
Hang on. But is that going to give feedback? If I turn up.
Hello. Testing. Microphone works.
Hang on. But is that going to give feedback? If I turn up. It is. How do I don't know how to hear you. Hang on, I'm sorry. Turn that on.
Can you hear me now?
Mark, you can hear me and I can't hear you.
Okay.
Speak to me now.
Hi, Susan. Hello. Hello.
Okay. Does that give feedback? Mark,
so
thank you
let's
for your patience, my darling.
Sure. Okay.
Are we good?
So
Is that
so
work?
I'm
Okay.
I can hear you.
Okay, good.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, it looks
and the
like
audience can hear you.
Mary and Valerie, I'm looking at comments, and it looks like they can hear both of us, so that's a step in the right direction.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Mark O'Donnell, good to see your face. How are you, friend?
I'm doing well. Been quite busy with everything, but you're one of my favorite people, Susan, and I'm very happy to be on your program, and I'm very proud of what you've done after leaving the Witnesses and why you left the Witnesses, and also your advocacy for animals. You know, has a special place in my heart, and so I'm very happy to talk to you, and good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. They're telling me we have a bit of a lag, and I'm not accustomed to having a guest, so I'll do my best to. Actually, I want you to talk more than me. Um, but if you would, Mark, just give my audience a brief overview of just who are you and what are you up to? What's your game, buddy?
What kind of trouble am I getting myself into these days? Okay, so well, it's nice to be here with everybody, including you, Susan. So my name's Mark O'Donnell, and so I was a Jehovah's Witness for 46 years of my life, and I was born into the religion. And when I was 46 and married to my wife Kimmy, I kind of had a little bit of a crisis of conscience of my own, and I knew something wasn't quite right with the Jehovah's Witnesses, and I started to see repetitive cycles year in and year out of new children being born into the religion and suffering a lot of the consequences of the religion that I suffered. And part of that was minimizing education, not being able to enjoy holiday celebrations or Thanksgiving or Mother's Day, Father's Day, or all of those things. It's not that I so much wanted to celebrate all those things, but I didn't want to be denied that, because I knew that the people who celebrated those things were actually good people, and many of them were persons of faith and others were not. So, I started recognizing after 4 decades or more in the religion, since birth, basically, that something wasn't right, and that there was a little bit more out there on the other side that was not properly represented by the JWs when they told us that people in the world were, angry and evil or apostates, or they're out to get you. It really kind of wore on me. And as I mentioned, I started seeing the next generation of children being born into our congregation, growing up, and then they were pushing them to baptism at a younger and younger age. I was baptized at 16, but now I've seen kids 8, 9, 10 years of age getting baptized. And it really troubled me because, analytically, I know, and most of us know, that when people come of age, whether it's 18, 21, whatever age you want to use for age of adulthood, but when people come of age, a large number of witness children do leave the organization. So there's a high rate of that. There's not a high rate of staying in the organization. There's a much higher rate of leaving. So it started to occur to me that some of these policies were really infringing upon the civil rights of young children who ultimately many of which would leave the organization. However, some of them never got the chance because, for example, in the blood policy, if you're a child, who was indoctrinated into the Jehovah's Witness system of beliefs, which teaches that, blood is abhorrent to Jehovah when it's taken into the body, okay, which is kind of contrary to the belief that blood is sacred. And witnesses do teach that blood is sacred, but they say that it's not to be used to sustain life, which is kind of ironic. It's, when we teach that something is sacred, we want to respect it and use it to sustain life. So what I started seeing was that children, many of which I grew up with, had died from this well before they became adults, well before 18. I've known babies that have died. I've known young children who have died. I remember a kid that got into a terrible automobile accident back in the 1980s, and I was at the hospital with hundreds of other witnesses. But I only learned later that it was, he was denied blood, which may have well saved his life in all likelihood, as well as other kids that I knew that were also in accidents that also died. I'm right here in Baltimore, where we have the Johns Hopkins I mean, they'll fly you to Johns Hopkins, one of the greatest research, teaching and practicing hospitals in the world, and they'll put you on a helicopter and fly you and save your life in the shock trauma unit, which is world famous. And yet, these witness kids I grew up with, several of which were flown to shock trauma, died because they couldn't take blood transfusions. And who's to say that they would have remained witnesses? So that's really my point, is that you're taking away the rights of a young person before their mind has had a chance to develop. And that to me is a form of coercion that I could no longer abide by. So that was one thing that kind of drove me out of the organization, just that thought of seeing the next generation go through this again. Got so many stories about this. Even after I stopped attending meetings in 2013, right after that happened, a good friend of mine who's very well known because he ran a company that supplied audio equipment to all the kingdom halls around the world, mostly U.S., Canada, Mexico, but very nice guy, likable guy, a grandfather, I think in his upper 50s, way too young to die, but he had a bad liver. And he needed he needed a transplant, a liver, but it's a very bloody operation. He was low on the list, partly because if you're a Jehovah's Witness and you refuse blood, the doctors aren't going to put you high up on the list for a donor organ. And so he died, and he was a friend of mine, and I've lost many other people that way. So it was that, and then there was other things, and I know a lot of people would probably ask me, well, was it child abuse? Well, it was and it wasn't. Child abuse wasn't what woke me up to leave, at least not initially. It actually reinforced why I left. In 2019, The Atlantic came and did an article called The Secret Database of Child Abuse, and they interviewed me for about a year, as well as my wife, Kimmy. And in that article, I revealed to them that when I was around 13, there was a man in the congregation named Louis Ancinco. He was this pioneer, he was just very charismatic. He was a flight attendant. Then he got involved in the massage industry. So, he had his hands on a lot of people, but what I noticed him doing was putting his hands on young girls in the congregation because he felt like he had a license to do that,
Mark,
metaphorically.
May I ask you to,
Yeah.
because the audience is not familiar with Jehovah's Witness terminology.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because most of them are not. We may have a few in here, but would you explain what you mean by he was a pioneer?
Yeah, thank you, Susan, for telling me that, because I wasn't familiar with your audience. So you're very wise to do that. And so within the Jehovah's Witnesses, you have baptized what they call publishers. So any person who gets baptized, of course, is expected to go into the door-to-door ministry or the letter writing ministry or telephone calling. In other words, the preaching work. And there is an expectation that you would get 10, 15, 20 hours a month in the preaching work for everybody. But there's special, what they call privileges. And one of those privileges is if you sign up and are approved to become a pioneer, which over the years, the number of required hours has changed. But when I was growing up, it was about 100 hours a month. They changed it to, let's see, it was 1,000 hours per year, which rounded out to about 83 hours per month. Now it's a little bit lower. Maybe it's down to 60 or so hours per month. So you have this special position, which, we'll get into, because it's kind of how you and I met regarding this man, Roderick Watkins, who lived in Arkansas and was abusing children, and he was a pioneer. So he was also a church elder. So yes, so the pioneer is a special preaching privilege that it's men and women can do it. Of course, only men can speak and teach in the congregation. That's one of the rules they have based on the writings of the Apostle Paul. So sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. That's one thing I didn't make clear to you that the majority of my audience are not familiar with the organization, which was one reason I wanted to lay a little groundwork before you came up, as well as get you to explain a few things to us. So thank you for explaining what a
Yeah.
pioneer is. Now, so you noticed that Lewis, the pioneer, was being inappropriate with some folks, I
Right.
think is where
So,
you were.
yeah, thank you for drawing
Yeah.
me back to that. So, I was maybe around 12, 13 years old, somewhere around there. I was pretty young at the time. And I saw that, this guy was, I had my suspicions about him, even as a child, because I was pretty naive. When you grow up as a Jehovah's Witness, you don't learn about politics, you don't learn about sex, except from their books, that they give you. There's, in fact, a lot of times parents just kind of shift the sex education from themselves to one of the Jehovah's Witness publications, like the what they call the youth book or the young people ask book, and they're expected to let the children read this and learn about this, and not really what the school teaches you, or what it's more about what the religion's doctrines teach about sex. So it's completely different from how kids
which is
normally would learn
which
this.
is pretty much just don't do it. Sex education for Jehovah's Witnesses is abstinence.
Yeah, of course, sex before marriage is banned. So you cannot live with someone to get to know them sexually, to see how they would interact, that you would interact with your partner. So there's none of that. So you have a lot of witnesses, most that get married with zero knowledge. And by the way, they get married very young in most cases because they want to have sex, but they're going to marry the first person they fall in love with, but it's mostly the feelings and the hormones and all of that. So you have a lot of marriages, 17, 18, 19, 20 years of age. So that's something very kind of peculiar to Jehovah's Witnesses and other fundamentalist religions. And I noticed that what Louis Ancinco was doing was pretty inappropriate, even as I was just a young person, and he was maybe in his 20s at the time. He seemed like, he was much older, but, he might have been 10 years older. But he was sort of the Pied Piper of the young people, and he gathered them into, weekend gatherings at his house where he was, teaching them to play the little flute or the recorder, and everybody thought, oh, this is a good idea. But what we didn't realize was that he was a predator. And so I reported what I saw to one of the elders in the congregation, because I thought, well, this is, it's just not right. I just feel like, based on what we're taught, this man kind of putting his hands inappropriately on girls went beyond what I thought was normal. It wasn't really grandfatherly. And he didn't have a wife and children. He was a single guy that it didn't seem to fit. So what happened was, when I told the elders about this, then they went to him, and he got pretty mad, and he got them to tell him who snitched on him. So then he got, he was angry with me and took it out on me within the congregation. He was a regular pioneer, so he was well thought of from that standpoint. But I think, I was probably one of the first people to speak up, if not the only person at the time. So that happened way back in, I think, the 1980s. And you fast forward to 2013, and I stopped going to Jehovah's Witness meetings. I left the religion. I told my wife, and she was pretty upset because she was also a born-in Jehovah's Witness that was very faithful, and she had been a pioneer also for many years. I was a ministerial servant in the religion, which is kind of like a deacon. It's the next step before becoming an elder in the religion. So, we were a well-respected couple for a very long time. And then I just stopped going to meetings, and that was upsetting to my wife. But it took her about a year to kind of wake up and make her own decision to leave. But so all of
And
these
we
things
do.
kind of, yeah, these things kind of weighed on me that when I left, I decided to go back and look up this Luis Ancinco to find out whatever happened to him. Because I started hearing about child abuse cases and it just kind of clicked in my mind. And I went back and I found court records that indicated that at least 7 or 8 different women, and I have the court records, but 7 to 8 different women filed sexual assault charges against him in a civil lawsuit that was filed some years ago that I never knew about. And now Lewis is since deceased, so we can talk about him, but we can also talk about, it's public record what he did. And he was
And you
working
mentioned,
for.
and you
Go
mentioned,
ahead.
Mark, that there were civil suits filed against Lewis. Um, can you help my audience understand why no criminal charges maybe had been filed against this man?
So that's a good question. I can I don't know if I know the answer to it, but I can give you an
Well,
idea.
a general
Yeah,
overview,
yeah.
because yeah, okay, yeah,
Sure, I get where you're going with this. So,
okay,
there's, for those that aren't familiar, of course, we have criminal law and civil law. And in criminal court cases is where somebody allegedly commits a crime and the state of Arkansas or Maryland decides that they're going to press charges and there's criminal penalties. It might be a fine, it could be prison time, depending on if it's a misdemeanor or a felony and so forth. So, when you tell church elders about something like that, Jehovah's Witnesses perform internal church investigations, and these things are almost never reported to the police. And we'll get into that with Roderick Watkins. So, to my knowledge, now I don't remember exactly when these women all came forward because the lawsuit was against Ancinco as well as the massage school that he worked for. It wasn't against the Jehovah's Witnesses, which many of the cases I deal with are against the Jehovah's Witness organization.
yeah.
But the massage school didn't properly vet him. So he was really abusing and assaulting women who were in the Jehovah's Witness church as well as in the massage school where he worked. And so that was just a wake-up call to me that kind of thing went on in the organization. And so, I think probably the statute of limitations expired and he was never charged criminally.
Because
That's,
it was never reported to law enforcement.
yeah, it was never reported. And the elders consider these kind of things as confidential matters that they handle internally. But at the same
Mark,
time, yeah.
go ahead.
Well,
Well,
I was going to say at the same time, I was right before I left the Witnesses, I discovered something far worse, which was that back in the 80s, I learned that back in the 80s, a man by the name of Charles Brinisholtz, who was a very prominent elder in my local congregation, had been doing a lot more than just assaulting women, but he was sexually molesting children. And not just one or two, but quite a few. And he had been moving from one location to another where he lived with different Jehovah's Witness families. And we were on vacation one year back in, it might have been 2010. And a close friend of mine who was an elder for many years said, oh, yeah, Brinisholtz was diddling children. And that really stuck in my mind. And I thought, how in the world are you just telling me this now? When I was a child, I was vulnerable to this man, and I find out that the elders all knew about it, and they did cover it up. And back in the 80s and 90s especially, there was a lot of that going on. I'm learning now, but the cover up, it was not reported to the police. And the Jehovah's Witnesses have a policy by which they consider their conversations that they have with abusers, especially if it's considered to be a confession. Now, but not all child abusers confess. Most don't. But if they consider it a confession, then they can argue to law enforcement and to civil courts. They can say this is not discoverable in a case, in a civil trial or a criminal trial. In other words, the elders, even though they know about this abuser, they won't divulge it because they say that this is protected by the clergy penitent privilege of our church elders. And they're not like the Catholic Church that has one priest. They might have 15 elders in a congregation. They might have 6 elders in a congregation. So there's so many men in the congregation that have knowledge of these things, and they write them up when they investigate them, but almost none of it is ever turned over to law enforcement.
Mark, can you tell my audience a little bit about how the accuser is treated by the elders and within the congregation? If, for example, a female who may have been molested or raped, or a child who has been inappropriately touched and reports it to an elder, how is the one doing the reporting treated?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because they are supposed to treat the flock with tenderness and compassion. These are elders, right? They're supposed to be ministers of the gospel. They're supposed to be, men of the cloth, whatever term you want to use. But one of the things that they do right away is they investigate not just the alleged perpetrator, but as you suggested, they talk to the accuser. And what they do is they determine whether or not they feel that the victim or the alleged victim who is making the accusation is party to the sin, is what they call a willing participant in their own sexual abuse. Another word for it is victim blaming. So what happens in many cases is, let's say you have a child that is, let's say 14 years old, and they somehow become groomed by a abuser in the congregation, which happens all the time. And it happens outside of the church, of course, happens in schools and other places. But what the Jehovah's Witness elders do is they look at both sides and they investigate to see whether or not the victim was a willing participant. In fact, they type all of this. Once the elders investigate, they call the Jehovah's Witness legal department in New York, and they type all this information into a database for their legal department and for their what they call service department. And when they type that information in, part of their investigation involves asking the elders whether the victim was a willing participant. In other words, did she or he participate in her own rape? Was she... they'll ask her very intimate sexual questions, like, I won't get into too much detail, but they'll ask questions like whether she was or he was, did they like it?
Gratified? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, did they orgasm? Did they, they're trying to get to the point of, if you have 2 baptized people, one is a minor that might be, 14 years old, whatever the age, and one is an adult who is grooming and molesting a child, taking advantage of them. Well, the fact of the matter is that, some children are groomed. I was just looking at your comments here. Esther says a child is a minor, they can't agree to participate. So that's correct, and if they, they shouldn't agree to participate. Now, some of them do, but they're victims. They're still victims because they've been groomed. They don't know any better. They're minors. Some of them fear for their life, and that the elders will ask all these questions. If the child is baptized as a Jehovah's Witness child, the elders view that child as being like an adult. In other words, they feel that they are of the age of, what's the word for it?
Accountability?
Yes. Exactly. That's exactly the word. That they are accountable for their actions, no matter how young they are. If they're baptized, that means that they accepted the rules and regulations of the Jehovah's Witness faith, and they're accountable, and therefore they are subject to being disfellowshipped. So we have many cases where Jehovah's Witness children, as young as 14, even less, have been disfellowshipped for having sexual contact with an adult who went to prison for what they did. And that was one of my first introductions to disfellowshipping, was when I was in high school. I was probably about 15 years old or so, and my parents had moved to a congregation in Baltimore County, not far from where I grew up in Baltimore City, but close by. And so I got to meet all these different young people. You know, I had new friends now that I was in a new congregation, and there was a disfellowshipping of a young girl who, you know, was a little bit older than me, but she was still a minor, and she was having sex, allegedly. I mean, she was with a man who was at least 3 times her age. And I think she was working part-time for him in his construction business, and that's what happened. So what happened was the elders didn't report that to the police. The father of the girl, who was a witness, was pretty angry about it. He did report it to the police, and the man went to prison for a long time. I don't know, he may still be in prison, but he went to prison, and they disfellowshipped the girl. They disfellowship the victim. They don't accept the fact that a person can be groomed and coerced and might not be guilty for having that happen to them. They don't accept that, not for a baptized child. Yeah. So that was a wake-up call, but it wasn't, I mean, that was when I was young. I guess maybe it wasn't a wake-up call as much as it was a shock.
Yeah.
That a young friend of mine was disfellowshipped, and we didn't know everything that happened, but later, you know,
they blame it's a blame game with the victim, pretty much within the organization. More often than not, at least from what I know, the victim is blamed as much, if not more, than the perpetrator. In regards to Roderick Watkins, Mark, do you recall the age of his youngest victim?
I can look. Yeah, approximately. I can pull the police report, and of course I won't use any names, but
yeah, we would. Yeah.
Yeah, they were pretty young. They were pretty young, and of course you know these people, Susan, because you were in the congregation, and you know, you were there at trial back in 2019.
I believe it was October of 2019, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. That's when you and I first met. And
yeah.
So to let your audience know, I'm not sure what you've told them, but I became aware of a case. It was brought to my attention by someone. I think it might have been a Reddit message, or it was an online message. Somebody tipped me off and said, Mark, a Jehovah's Witness elder, or somebody who had just been removed as an elder, but he was an elder for a long time. His name was Roderick Watkins, and they told me that the police were investigating him and had just arrested him. And that was, I think the arrest took place, let's see, the trial was in 2019. I think the arrest took place in 2018, and he was out on like $100,000 bail. Mm-hmm. And, you know, to give a little backstory, this man, Roderick... So Roderick Watkins was a guy that grew up in North Carolina, outside of Charlotte. I think he went to Shelby High School. So he was in a congregation down there. You know, he was, you know, I don't know if his father was a witness at the time. I know his brother became a witness, and, you know, they became, you know, pretty gung-ho as far as being Jehovah's Witnesses. He saw an opportunity, you know, and I don't know when the abuse started. I'm still investigating it. But, you know, he saw an opportunity to be a part of a religious organization that he could thrive in. And so there goes a cattail.
Now that my viewers are used to.
Yes. Well, we'll, to take a little bit of the...
They're on the other side of this closed door for today, because I was already nervous to begin with.
Yeah. That's okay. She's sitting in a box right next to me, and I have 3 boxes on 3 levels, and right now two of the 3 levels are filled with cats. And
Yeah.
so
Viewers,
they,
Mark and his wife Kimmy are also cat rescuers. That was something
yeah,
we recognized in one another right away. So, anyways,
yeah.
go ahead.
We did. So this guy Roderick Watkins, so he became a pioneer. So we've explained that term. It's a basically full-time minister for Jehovah's Witnesses. So he became a pioneer. Now this was back in the 1980s. He he applied to work permanently at the world headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses, which at the time was in Brooklyn, New York, and he was accepted. So he went for somewhere around 5 years. He's a single person when he goes in to the world headquarters, and they call that being a Bethelite. So that's a full-time worker. So he basically is working 6 days a week, going to meetings on Sundays, and doing a whole lot of other stuff. You devote your entire life, but it's considered to be a rare privilege for Jehovah's Witnesses to work at the headquarters in Brooklyn. So that was back in the mid 1980s, maybe 83, 84, in that neighborhood. I have the dates. But he goes to work for world headquarters. He had already been a pioneer, so he's very charismatic. He's extremely well liked by everybody. So he's working, I think, for a long time in the dining room. It wasn't a special job by any means, but he, had kind of a menial job. But while he was there, people come and go all the time as visitors. So a woman from Arkansas named Becky came to visit. I think her sister actually was working at Bethel at the world headquarters. So yeah, so Becky came to visit, and she met Roderick Watkins, and one thing led to another, and they decided they wanted to get married and reapply and stay in Bethel service full time. So they did. They managed, and sometimes that's not so easy, because when you get married, they don't automatically accept the wife. So she has to apply. She had to, she was a pioneer also. So, all of those factors, along with Roderick's very charismatic personality, got them both accepted. And this was, again, towards the mid to late 80s. So he had been in Bethel a few years. He gets married to Becky, and then something went terribly wrong. And that was and this came out at trial, by the way, but I know there's more to the story. But while he was at Bethel, he's newly married. He has a homosexual experience with someone whose age we don't really know. We think they were a young person. They were either in Bethel with him or in a local congregation. They went on a camping trip, which those kind of things happen all the time. And there was sexual contact between him and this young man. I don't know yet the extent of his, predatory behavior with other young men in New York while he was in New York. We only know later what he did. But so because Jehovah's Witnesses abhor homosexuality, he actually went to the Bethel elders and first, because he would have been disfellowshipped from the Jehovah's Witnesses if he hadn't come clean immediately. So we don't know the identity of the other person involved. I have some suspicions, but the long story short of that was that he was kicked out of Bethel, but he was not disfellowshipped. So this man already has, possible predatory behavior towards young men. We don't know, again, if that young man was a minor. At the very least, we know that Roderick Watkins was gay or bisexual. So, but he was newly married. So it's a very interesting dynamic there.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So he was ejected from Bethel, which is really not a good thing at all. He goes back to North Carolina with his wife. She stayed with him, and she even discussed that at the trial.
Yeah.
They asked her something about why didn't she get a divorce at that point. So anyway, they go back to North Carolina, and he goes kind of undercover for maybe 6 weeks or so. And I think they were telling people kind of a story that they were pioneering in a remote area in North Carolina. So they were kind of trying to cover up what happened at the world headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses. And meanwhile, though, he decides he's going to reemerge and get himself back in the good graces because he hadn't been disfellowshipped. So he becomes a pioneer again. And I don't know how he got so quickly appointed as a pioneer. I do know that he had some close friends in high places. Someone said Boys Club. Yeah. Boys Club up there. And he, even though he had a low position in Bethel, he had friends in high places. And there are some suspicions about the relationships that he had with these men. But I won't go into that. But suffice it to say, he wasn't disfellowshipped, and he quickly got back up the ladder, got back on his feet, and he and his wife were pioneers, and they stayed in North Carolina for a short period of time, and then off they went into the pioneer ministry outside of the state. And that's one of the best ways you can advance yourself in the Jehovah's Witnesses, is to put yourself as a pioneer, and you're married and you're a man, so you can be an elder and have all these responsibilities. So he goes on to move to Kansas, and I have addresses in at least 3 different locations where he lived. He was pioneering, he was in different congregations. I don't think he was in Kansas longer than a year when he got an opportunity that came up. And that opportunity was to move to Indiana, and right on the Ohio border. And let me make sure I've got the state and location right. It wasn't Illinois. It was Indiana. And I think it was West Harrison.
That sounds right.
Yeah. So there was a Kingdom Hall and a congregation that had an apartment that was part of that Kingdom Hall. And because some Kingdom Halls have a little apartment for the traveling overseer, which is what we call a circuit overseer. He's a special elder that's over like 20 or 30 congregations and visits the congregations on behalf of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. He visits twice a year, and it's supposed to be a very special, encouraging visit. But he's also an enforcer. So normally you have these men staying in these apartments, but the apartment happened to be open. And somehow Roderick Watkins got himself an invitation to live in the apartment in the Kingdom Hall, which means that he can be rent-free, and he can work a few part-time jobs because that's what he did. He was a, painter, handyman. He didn't have any specialized skills. He had never been through college. Of course, most witnesses are not educated. So he goes on to live in this apartment. Meanwhile, he's become reappointed not only as a pioneer, of course, but as an elder in the congregation, and with the position of service overseer, which is a special position in the congregation where he's on what's called the service committee. So it's one of the top 3 elders in the congregation as far as decision making, and he had a lot of control over who worked with who in the field ministry. And by the way, they had a lot of kids in that area. So this is where things turn really, really dark, aside from what happened in Brooklyn Bethel, because we don't know all the details of that. But when he got to Indiana, it turns out that he was maneuvering all of these young people, particularly boys, mostly boys, but he didn't discriminate, but it was mostly boys, that he was able to manipulate into Bible studies with him. And often it was happening at the Kingdom Hall in the church building, where they lived. And without going into too much detail, he was essentially drugging and raping young Jehovah's Witness boys in the Kingdom Hall. And I've interviewed one of the victims that this happened to, and the victim's sister as well, who was really helpful to the investigation and ultimately is responsible for blowing the whistle for what happened down in Arkansas. So they're in Indiana for a number of years. He's extremely well liked. He's an elder. He has got this prominent position in the congregation. He's giving special talks at assemblies for Jehovah's Witnesses. Meanwhile, he's abusing and raping. We don't know how many. One of his victims' sister told me that she thinks it's 100 victims. Well, we don't know. Well, we know it's a lot. Some of the victims have since committed suicide. Some have died of terrible illnesses. It's just a really bad and sad thing that happened. But in the year 2000, the Watchtower, the governing corporation for Jehovah's Witnesses, made an announcement that if you are not a special pioneer, which is a higher rank or higher privilege, or if you're not a circuit overseer, you can't live in a Kingdom Hall apartment. So Roderick Watkins and his wife, they were just regular pioneers, is what we call it. And he was an elder. So very important, but something was up with that announcement. That was the year 2000. And so they had to leave. They had to leave that building. And meanwhile, we know that his wife knew what was going on with him, because she would often leave these boys home to be studied with by him. And at one point, one of the victims that had been drugged and molested, Roderick Watkins' wife shows up at home, and this boy was still drugged, and she had to take him home in a drugged state and explain to the boy's parents that he just feels sick, has the flu, and he ended up not going to school the next day. So she knew what was going on. We have other evidence from talking to law enforcement as well. But the bottom line is that he still maintained this great reputation in that, in the organization in Indiana. But they had to move. So what they did was they went to Arkansas. And that's where you and I come in, because, you're an Arkansas native, I think, right? But
not a native, but pretty much.
Yeah, that's right. So we can get in. From Arkansas. Okay.
Yeah.
So what happens is Becky's family, as I mentioned before, is from Arkansas. So they moved to Arkansas, and in a roundabout series of events, they wind up where Becky gets a job working literally 100 yards from the Kingdom Hall, managing a kind of a low-income community, which is maybe 20 or 30 housing units. It's a nice little U-shaped community. So Becky gets that job managing the community, and Roderick Watkins becomes the handyman. So he's got a job, and meanwhile, he gets reappointed as an elder, and this is Heber Springs, Arkansas. So when you look at a map, you'll see that the Kingdom Hall is right on the corner, and the community where Roderick lived, it's the little U-shaped community. You could walk to it in 2 minutes at most.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So he's close to the Kingdom Hall, but that's only the very tip of the iceberg here, because what he was doing to children, in Indiana, is what he picked right up on again doing in Arkansas. And he wasn't living in the Kingdom Hall, but he was bringing these children. They had lots of gatherings. They were, he was bringing them to his house. And I like to pause and stop and think how horrible this was, because here's a man who he moved to Arkansas in the year 2000, when many of his victims had not even been born yet. And he would go on to ruin their lives. And I say this because you asked me how young some of the victims are or were. They were pretty young, like I think 5, 6, 7 years of age, but all the way up to about 15, because the oldest victim who testified at trial is now in his 20s. But when the abuse happened, he might have been 17, 18 at the time. I'm trying to remember, because the charges were brought, I think, based on child abuse charges for him as well.
Yes, that was the abuse that took place at the Arkansas Razorback football game. That victim.
Correct. Yes, there were. In fact, in his case,
he also. Go ahead.
Yeah, at a party. At a party.
Yeah, at a party. Yeah, at the home of another elder.
Yeah.
But the abuse that took place at the Arkansas Razorbacks football game, which is our University of Arkansas, it's our college team here. This abuse took place during a game in the stadium in front.
Yeah.
The young man's father was standing right there.
Right there. Right there. And
I'm sorry.
yeah,
Go
it's,
ahead.
without going into the details, I mean, you can just
Yeah.
kind of imagine what he was trying to do in the middle of, 60,000 some people in the stadium,
Yeah.
and they were all the way up in the high area. He was with three other people, including his own father and Roderick Watkins, and I think one other person. And, it's like, it triggers the freeze complex. You don't know what to do. He
Yeah.
finally got away from him at that. He was able to move later and get away and be with his father. But he couldn't tell anybody at first, but
Yeah.
ultimately he did tell someone. And yeah, so meanwhile the other children were much younger, and some of them were girls. And I mean, it was really horrific what he was doing, because he was using the church. Like, for example, he would go and give a talk at a different congregation, and they all trusted him, and they would send their daughter or son with him to go give a public talk, like the Sunday sermon, at another Jehovah's Witness church down the road, and he would molest them in the car. And one of the young ladies testified about what he did in the car on the way to this, giving a public sermon to the church.
Mark, I'm reminded of the young lady, the victim, when she was on the stand. I know you will recall when the judge had to send the jury out because the young lady on the witness stand became so distraught,
Yeah.
giving her testimony in regards to the abuse she suffered at Roderick Watkins' hands. The jury literally had to be sent out of
Yes.
the room, and she had to regain her composure
Yeah.
because that particular victim, Roderick Watkins, and Mark, please correct me, I may get a detail wrong here, you know how my mind is, but he would purposefully keep it cool within so that a child
Yes.
would ask to be covered with a blanket.
Yeah. Yeah, that was in
And
his apartment. You're right.
and he would he had groomed these children to the point that the little girl was sitting on his lap with a blanket over her
With other
and
people.
a room with other Jehovah's Witnesses around, and
Yeah.
he was fondling her under the
Yeah.
blanket.
Yeah, that's exactly
That's
right.
yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. To manipulate the temperature in the room. Well, let's keep it nice and cool so that the blanket's needed, and he can do that. That's just one of many, many things. And by the way, all the children,
Many.
this man is so corrupt that he forced, by him not taking a plea deal, he forced these children to testify, which was horrific for them. I remember you had contacted me just before the trial, and you had reached out by email, and you said, I'm Susan Brewer from Heber Springs, and I replied to you briefly. So you and I had an exchange, and I think you gave me your phone number. So you knew that I was coming to the trial.
Yeah.
Of course, we didn't meet until the first day of the trial. And you were still a very active Jehovah's
So
Witness at the time.
it had to, this all viewers, this all had to be very secretive between Mark and
Yeah.
I, because I was an active Jehovah's Witness. Mark had left the board, and so I was not allowed to speak with him, any contact with him, because he's considered, and so am I now, an apostate. And it would be a disfellowshipping, or at least a soft shunning on me
Yeah.
to have any. So you have to sneak around. We had to sneak around. So
Well, you were
I'm
pretty
sorry
bold.
to interrupt. Please.
No, you're
Well,
telling
yeah.
it. You are. I'll never forget in the middle of the trial, and I was there. Another couple lawyers that I work with, or that I'm friends with, and one that I work with came up to the trial because they were not far away in Texas, and
Are you
one
talking
of
about Neil?
Neil, yeah. So Neil's from Texas, and
Yeah.
he came up for the trial because he had, well, he was very interested in the outcome of the trial, and he actually does represent or did represent one of the victims from Indiana. That's another story, but he
Yeah.
wanted to see. So Neil came up, and I'll never forget when we were in the parking lot after we went through at least one day of the trial,
It was a lunch
and
recess. Yeah.
yeah. So you came up to me, and there were a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses standing around in that parking lot outside of the courtroom, and I was talking to Neil and the other attorney that had come up to see what was going on. And the first thing you said to me was, "I didn't sign up for this." I'll never forget that.
I
Meaning
didn't
that as a
sign up.
Jehovah's Witness, you were learning things in that courtroom that they didn't want you to know, but also you were learning something else. You were learning about the cover up. And one of the most profound moments at the trial itself, which I learned about later, which I understood later from the detective who arrested Roderick Watkins, was that during the trial, when the older boy testified, what actually it was not his testimony. It was let me go back. The prosecutors, I think they were maybe examining Roderick Watkins or his wife, and so what they did was they asked Watkins on the witness stand about the incident going all the way back to New York, back in the 1980s, where he had this homosexual relationship with a young man, sexual contact. We don't know how many times it happened. He downplayed it, of course, but they found
Yeah.
out about it. They knew about it. They mentioned it to him at trial, that this happened in New York all those years ago. So and I didn't fully understand it at the time until the detective explained it to me. But during that testimony, where it was revealed what happened in New York, one of the mothers, the mother of the older boy,
Yeah.
got up and in hysterics, crying ran out of the courtroom.
Yeah.
And I didn't know at the time, that was his mother. But the detective, when the trial was over, I ran into the detective and we talked for hours. But the detective told me that was this older boy's mother, and that was because in court, she's learning that Roderick Watkins was predatory towards young boys, or at least young men, and the Jehovah's Witness headquarters knew about it for 30 years. They knew about it back in New York. And I'm not here to make a correlation between a person who's gay and a child abuser. I want to make that clear. That is not
Yeah.
the case.
Yeah.
But
That's not.
what I'm
That's not.
what I'm saying is that it appeared to be predatory behavior. However old this young man was in New York, it appeared to be predatory behavior, and Roderick Watkins weaseled his way out of it without getting disfellowshipped, and nobody ever knew. By the time he comes to Arkansas after all those other congregations and abusing other kids, then here he is in a responsible position, having Bible studies, taking this young man fishing, taking him to the Razorbacks games in Arkansas and all of this. And his mother was in hysterics because she's finding out that his son was with a predator, and she has to find this out in court at a trial.
Yeah.
She doesn't know this.
It was.
Yeah.
It was her.
So a lot of
Keep thinking. Go ahead. Go ahead.
oh, sorry, our
You go.
connection was breaking up a little bit, but that's okay. Well, so you and I had a chance to meet and talk, and it was a very difficult trial because Roderick Watkins, he was given the opportunity to take a plea deal all the way up until the night before the trial. because they wanted to respect those young children so they wouldn't have to testify because they were young. They were still 10, 11, 12 years of age, up to the older boy who was a little older in his young 20s. But the abuse spanned a wide generation. And the prosecutors, they had offered him 40 years. And there were 4 counts. Now, there were a lot more child abuse victims that they interviewed, but they selected 4 and charged Watkins with 4 counts that they felt were strong enough to send a message to put him in prison. So they selected 4. 3 were still very young. 1 was the older boy. And they offered Roderick Watkins a 40-year sentence, and they would avoid trial. That would have been a plea agreement. And he refused. Now, bear in mind that according to Arkansas law, whatever your sentence is, you can actually be out in 1/6 of the sentence in Arkansas because of the way the law works. And you have to do a couple things. Number one, obviously, you have to serve 1/6 of your sentence, but you also have to admit guilt, and you have to go through all the programs that they mandate you must go through. If you're a child abuser, obviously you're going to be on, you're going to be on a list. You're going to be on the Megan's list, child sex offender registry, but you're also going to have to take a lot of courses admitting your guilt, following through with all your probation requirements. So anyway, if you take that 40-year sentence, he could have been out in 1/6 of the time if he had done that admission. Okay. So then at the very last moment, while I'm in the air flying, it's 2 flights to get to Heber Springs or to Little Rock. And then I had rented a car, and they offered him 30 years, final offer, 30 years. So, he could have been out in 5 years. Technically, he could have been out of prison in 5 years if he had admitted guilt, gone through all of the stuff I just mentioned. And he said, no, I'm going to go to trial. And not only did he go to trial and make all those kids testify, but he took the witness stand, which, probably the dumbest thing he could have done. And he had he had a low-cost lawyer because he couldn't afford much. And it wiped him out. And I think a lot of the money came from his wife's parents, and I'm sure that wiped them out. And he didn't have any money left after, obviously he was found guilty, and he appealed, and he was indigent at that point. He had nothing left, so he had to get a court-appointed attorney, which turned out to be the same attorney he had before, but he was now being paid by the state of Arkansas. So that cost Arkansas another $2,000 or $3,000 to pay for his, appeal. But at sentencing, the jury came back with 80 years. They had no mercy on this man. It was 20 years per count. And, I'll never forget I'll still remember the handcuffs being placed on him because I was just a few feet away from him. And I think you were on the side with the witnesses, supporting the victims, which was
and
good.
Mark, taking into consideration that neither of us are psychologists or anything of that nature, I've often wondered, just in discussion here, if I'm trying to put this, it almost seemed like Roderick Watkins wanted those children to have to take that stand in front of him and a courtroom full of people. It was almost like he got some sort of gratification out of these children having to testify and what they suffered while they were on the witness stand, the retelling. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, you might be right. I never looked at it that way, but you might be right about that. I also think that he thought that he was smarter than he really was. I mean, here's a very
Yeah.
eloquent but very uneducated Jehovah's Witness who essentially was, washing windows or, you know, um, painting condominiums. I mean, he was a handyman, and he thought that he could go up against an elected. I mean, they brought in an elected prosecutor and his top man to prosecute this case. This guy is not a joke, and
That's right.
he let him have it. You remember that. The transcript doesn't do justice to how he ripped Roderick Watkins up one side of his body and down the other. And I think Watkins was just left virtually speechless. And there were gasps in the audience when Roderick Watkins tried to invoke Jehovah's Witness teachings and even their website, the
Oh, yeah.
jw.org website. They were so angry. And then we had victim impact statements. So not only did the children have to testify, but the parents of the children testified, giving victim impact statements. And so they threw the maximum at him. And the jury came back and said, yes, the 80 years. And
I
so
was trying, do you remember how long was the jury out? It was a pretty quick turnaround.
yeah, I don't think I might, it's probably in my notes. It's in my
I,
notes, maybe an hour.
yeah,
It
not long
wasn't
at
long.
all. And when the jury came back in, we were like, wow, I think we're
Yeah.
going to get a guilty verdict here. But I've often wondered if Watkins got some sort of sick satisfaction out of his victims having to relive their experiences.
I don't know. I think maybe you're right. I think he's so delusional though that
Yeah.
and this is something that is partly obviously it's his fault, but it's also the Jehovah's Witness insular nature of their religion that it takes
It
us so far.
enabled him. It enabled him to
Yeah,
do what he did.
yeah, it did. It did. So this is much part of it. You asked me earlier what I do and what's going on, and it's much
Yeah.
part of this is just one case. And I've been to other, criminal and civil cases before. A lot of these cases are cases where the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses didn't report child abuse when the law said they should report, or even if there's not a law, you can sue based on what's called common law negligence, and that's happening in the state of. These are civil trials, and in the state of Washington, right now we're trying to get mandatory reporting for clergy or elders passed. Okay, but up to this point, there's no clergy mandated reporting, so priests or elders don't have to report child abuse. It's not mandatory. So Jehovah's Witnesses never report when it's not mandatory. And even when it is mandatory, they still don't report most of the time because they invoke what they call the clergy penitent privilege.
Hmm.
But in states like Washington, you still can sue based on common law negligence. So there's a couple of types of negligence. There's common law negligence and there's negligence per se, which means per the law, meaning if you have if it's like if you're a doctor and your patient comes to you and says, that she's maybe you're a pediatrician and your patient says to you that, somebody is touching you because the doctor notices something's wrong, so once the doctor realizes that the child's been harmed or molested, the doctor has to immediately, by law, has to call Child Protective Services or the police or whatever agency they're required to call in that state. They have to. So that's called negligence per se. So if you don't do that, not only could you be criminally held liable by the state for failure to report if you're a doctor or a nurse or a teacher, but you can also be sued civilly. And that's what's happening in, for example, Washington State and other places where even though they don't have clergy reporting for child abuse, the Jehovah's Witness organization can still be sued for common law negligence. Common law negligence means it's almost like common sense negligence or common sense law. Because Susan, if I come over to your house and you have a relative there that's abusing a young child, and I don't I don't do anything about it. I just walk away. Well, Susan's my friend. She'll deal with it, but if I knew, and then that child later is killed or is raped or whatever, well, you know, did I do the right thing? I knew some child was being harmed by a relative of yours, and you had no idea what was going on. I'm just giving one of a million scenarios. But the
Yeah.
point is that we all have an obligation, even for animals that are being abused, but we all have an obligation to step up, stand up, do the right thing, see something, say something. It's to protect children in particular. We all have that obligation. So that's called common law negligence. If you have a group of elders in the Washington State congregation of Snohomish County, whatever, if they knew there was a predator in their midst and that there were allegations of child sexual abuse of one or more victims, even though there's not a mandatory reporting law for clergy, if they sat there and did nothing and these children went on to be abused continually, they can be sued civilly for what's called common law negligence. And so we have a number of cases that are going on right now in Washington State against the Jehovah's Witness organization because of common law negligence. The elders are, regardless of the law, they are people that are looked up to. You know this, having been a Jehovah's Witness. They are the men of the congregation. They are responsible for the welfare of the congregation spiritually and in other ways. So if they know something, quite often people report things to elders that they wouldn't even report to the police because they feel maybe more comfortable talking to somebody that's, like a clergyman.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't get to
I've
the
been
police and the child's not protected, that is negligence. And you can sue for that.
I watched I believe it's the Senate hearings in Washington State that you have on your channel. I know that Mark will tell us that his channel is not developed. That I believe that's the word he used. But what Mark does have on his channel are the hearings, the Senate hearings, and things of that nature. And the latest one that I watched were the Senate hearings in Washington State in this regard.
Yeah,
So,
well,
yeah,
yeah, thank you.
yeah. I'm
Um,
going to go back and
well,
watch that again.
so right, but it is undeveloped in the sense that there's a lot more hearings that have come out since then. I participated in one of them where I gave testimony on behalf of being in favor of mandatory reporting for clergy, but I was against the confessional exception because what happens is, in the Catholic Church, supposedly, you can go anonymously and confess something to a priest, and allegedly, the priest doesn't know who you are, and you can confess your sins. And what the Catholic Church is saying is that that is sacred, it's enshrined in law, and that the Constitution of the United States and the Establishment Clause of the Constitution says that that religion cannot infringe on, or that government cannot infringe on or create laws for religion. In other words, the two can't, they can coexist, but, they can't control each other. So because of these things, the Catholic Church strongly argues that they should be able to keep anything confidential within the confessional booth, okay? Now, here's the problem. Catholic is just one religion. They're a big one, but there's, hundreds and hundreds of other religions, including Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, the Jehovah's Witnesses say you cannot discriminate against us because we have 10 or 15 elders in a congregation, and all of these elders might learn about this confession of a child abuser. And, they're saying that you cannot apply, it's unconstitutional to apply the Catholic model to the Jehovah's Witnesses. So it's a real problem because a lot of people that are Jehovah's Witness elders in the congregation do become aware of child abuse, and they keep records of it, and they send copies of those records to New York. They call the legal department of the Jehovah's Witnesses in New York. That call is then transferred to what they call the service department, and they keep records. They guide the elders locally on whether they should disfellowship a person, either for child abuse or for being a willing participant in child abuse. So there's all this interaction. So with the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's way different than the Catholic Church because they're in the business of investigating sin. The Catholic Church is not so much doing that anymore. They're just trying to get a grasp on what their priests have done over the years. And a lot of bad priests did molest children, and a lot of that was covered up. But it's different with the Jehovah's Witnesses because not only do you have a priest like Roderick Watkins, an elder and priest essentially the same thing, he molested children, but there's also average congregation members that are not elders who also molest children. And all of this gets presented to the entire body of elders. Once they discover it or somebody reports it to them, they launch first a 2-man investigation. And then if they say, well, we want to assign this as a judicial committee to determine if these people should be disfellowshipped or not, then they assign and form a 3-person judicial committee. And by the way, they did that with Roderick Watkins. It took a long time. By the way, they had more than the required 2 witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses have a 2-witness rule.
The old 2-witness rule, a whole nother rabbit hole.
Right. The 2-witness rule says that within a spiritual congregational setting, that you cannot convict a man of a sin inside the congregation without one of 2 things, either 2 witnesses to corroborate the sin or a confession. Well, most child abusers don't confess. Roderick Watkins didn't confess. He was not disfellowshipped for a long time until finally they got word from another state, as I mentioned, from Indiana. They got word that, he had molested children up there, and eventually they put 2 and 2 together. And they had ample evidence of what was going on down in Arkansas. And so that was when, I have the date on it, but I think it was like July of 2018. They did disfellowship finally, after all those, almost 20 years of abuse in Arkansas, plus what happened in the other states. They finally disfellowshipped him, and then he was arrested 3 or 4 months later. His defense was basically, his defense at trial was to say that all these Jehovah's Witness kids were colluding against him. They ganged up on him. They didn't like him. Well, that was the opposite of the truth, because they all, until he molested them, he was worshipped in the congregation. One of the victims' parents who testified and who I think gave a victim impact statement, and you know exactly who I'm talking about, this poor woman, she got cancer. She had 2 very young kids.
Yeah.
And she got cancer, and it was too much for her and her husband, and she thought she was going to die. She went into the hospital for advanced cancer treatments. She was in really bad shape, and they turned their children over to the care of Roderick Watkins and his wife. While she was suffering with cancer in the hospital, Roderick Watkins abused both of those children. And she survived, and then found out what he had done to those children.
And
while she was in the hospital.
She had major heart surgery 2 weeks before Roderick Watkins' trial, after having survived the terrible bout with cancer.
And she had heart disease. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I started getting emotional there, but as you know, Mark, these people were my personal friends. I know the parents. I know the children.
Yeah.
So but
yeah, I know these are people that you even stayed in contact with after the trial and before you left the witnesses and you disassociated yourself. I know that was a very difficult decision for you because, for your audience to know that, you were very brave in speaking to me. Most witnesses would be afraid to speak to a reporter or an apostate or anything of that nature because they view it as opposing Jehovah's organization, his teachings. You came up to me in that parking lot and said, Mark, I didn't sign up for this. And you saw what happened at that trial. And halfway through the trial, you sent me a message, because you said, can you come over? And
we made
I came
arrangements for a clandestine after dark meeting.
So I left my hotel room after dark and I came over to your house with pen and paper. And of course I put that down real quick when I realized you had cats everywhere. And that was the favorite part of my visit, was that you had these.
We sat
brand
around
new
the dining
kittens.
room table with Bob and we enjoyed
Yeah.
coffee, and Wang Ching Cheetah Burrito was a kitten. And he climbed up and stayed
Yeah.
flat, I believe, through most of our conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love those cats and kittens, and I took notes, but we just had a good time talking, and it was great to meet you and Bob. And
and you got up to leave that evening. As I recall, you were heading out the door, but you looked back over your shoulder, or you turned back around and you said, Susan, have you ever heard of Candace Conti? Or remind me of the name. Was it Candace Conti?
Yeah, yeah, Conti.
And I was like, no, I have never heard that name. And you gave me the name of, at the time, it was the John Cedar channel. Now it's Lloyd Evans. But, and you just were kind of like, one of these days when you get around to it, go check out this guy's channel or look up this woman's name. I can't remember exactly how the exchange took place, but it lingered back here. After you went back to Baltimore and our lives went on, and eventually I did so. So and Candace Conti is one of the more, what would be the proper adjective? Her abuse suffered as a...
Yeah, so Candace Conti was a minor, a child at the time this all happened in California years ago, and she was being groomed and molested by a man named Jonathan Kendrick, and the elders were obviously involved in that case once they found out, and it was covered up. It wasn't reported to the police by the elders. Later, that resulted in a lawsuit against the Jehovah's Witnesses and a 10-day trial. It's the longest trial of that nature, of a civil lawsuit against the Jehovah's Witnesses. It was a 10-day trial, and it ended in about a $26.2 million jury verdict against the Jehovah's Witnesses. So later, that award was reduced, and then the trial or the case kept going, and ultimately it resulted in a settlement. As you know, most of these cases, they drag on for years. And just like with the Catholic Church, the Jehovah's Witnesses, most of the time they don't go to trial. I've been to, I think, 2 of the 3, civil trials that there have ever been against the Jehovah's Witnesses, because that sounds like not a lot, but 100 times that are the number of cases that the Watchtower or the Jehovah's Witnesses just settle. So what happens is they get to the point in the negotiations or in the dispute back and forth over discovery, turning over church documents, and all of these things. They finally get to the kind of an impasse where the Jehovah's Witnesses say, we're just going to settle this. And they might write a check for $500,000, $2 million. I've seen cases that ended up in more than $10 million for a single victim. Of course, I can't mention any names because these are all private settlements. And sometimes you come to learn about what happened in my line of work. And the Jehovah's Witnesses have been paying out millions of dollars, not just in settlements, but in the legal fees that they are paying to dozens and dozens and dozens of law firms that are defending them across the U.S., in California, New York. I mean, they just settled 9 or 10, 12 cases in New York. This January. They just settled another prominent Utah case. I've been involved in cases that have settled. We've got a couple of cases in Montana going on right now. We had a big one in Montana where I was at trial that resulted in a $35 million judgment against Jehovah's Witnesses by the jury at that time. It judged them because they had failed to report child abuse. And long story short, that ended up settling. But it's a real problem.
Yeah.
And, for a person like yourself, one of my goals, Susan, is transparency. So you were the perfect person to talk to because you were a very dedicated, active witness at the time I met you, but you had some concerns. You found out this man in your congregation had abused all these kids, and, the elders never called the police. It was parents who ultimately found out and called the police. And the Jehovah's Witnesses didn't cooperate with the investigation. I spoke to the detective who actually gave me the name of the lawyer that she spoke to at Watchtower headquarters, who said, I'm not giving you any. You want something? Give me a subpoena. There's no cooperation because they say, we are a church. We have this cloak of authority and this cloak of clergy penitent privilege that protects us both with the clergy penitent privilege as well as their attorney-client privilege. So all of this has led up to some very serious investigations. Right now in Pennsylvania, we have the grand jury investigation. The state of Pennsylvania, just like they investigated the Catholic Church, now they're investigating Jehovah's Witnesses. Every single congregation in the state is under subpoena to turn over every child abuse or child pornography document back to January of 1987. And Jehovah's Witnesses have hired the Kleinbard law firm, which is the same law firm that defended the Catholic Church. They've hired Kleinbard to do two things. Number one, to handle all of the documents that are coming from every single congregation subpoenaed in Pennsylvania, which is hundreds. So they're dealing with probably thousands of cases.
Can you imagine? Oh my word.
It's a big state. They've got 250, 300 congregations and plus foreign language congregations.
Yeah.
And all the way back to 1987, they're processing a huge amount of data. They've already issued 2 presentments, which means they've arrested 9 Jehovah's Witnesses so far in the state of Pennsylvania on cases that they could prosecute that weren't past statute of limitations or other factors. Because for every 9 cases that they are able to prosecute and put people in jail for child abuse, there's probably 20 times that that they can't prosecute or more because of various reasons. They don't have enough evidence, they don't have enough documentation, or maybe the victim's deceased or the perpetrator's already deceased, because this investigation goes way back. So they're making arrests and they're working their way up the chain of the organization. And secondly, the Jehovah's Witnesses have filed a lawsuit going back to 2020 against the Department of Human Resources in Pennsylvania. So the JWs are suing not for money, but they're suing over the law. It's called the Ivy Hill case. It's Ivy Hill Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses against Pennsylvania Department of Human Services. I'm going to be reporting on this, but not many people know about it. But they are challenging the law. They're saying that the law for clergy reporting is discriminatory against Jehovah's Witnesses, because Jehovah's Witnesses don't have the same setup as Catholic Church or other churches. And it's very complicated right now, so I won't get into all the details. But basically, that's what they're doing, is they're suing and saying that what happened in Pennsylvania was the police arrested an Amish bishop several years ago because he didn't report child abuse. And it's a felony to not report child abuse if you're a mandated reporter. The bishop was arrested and charged. The Jehovah's Witnesses got very upset about this because they realized that their elders could be next. And already at the same time, I was at trial in Illinois, in Chicago, outside of Chicago, for 2 elders who were charged with misdemeanor not reporting child abuse, and they were found guilty. Now, the penalty is almost nothing. But the point is, they were found guilty a year ago in Chicago, in McHenry County. And the
I
Jehovah's
remember when you were
Witnesses.
there. Mm.
Yeah, at trial 4 weeks in a row, including sentencing. That
Yeah.
was a lot of travel because it was one
Which may
day and then.
which may be
Go
one
ahead.
reason your YouTube channel is not developed, because Mark O'Donnell is actually a journalist who literally flies around the country and sits in the courtroom, covers the case, and then reports on it.
Yeah, and I'm backed
So
up
he's
on
a pretty
reporting.
busy guy.
Well, thank you,
Yeah.
Susan. And yeah, I am backed up on reporting, but number one comes doing, number two comes reporting. So I have to do the doing part
Yes.
first, plus take care of my mom and other responsibilities and all these cats I'm surrounded with.
Yeah.
But but yeah,
Well,
you got to do
Mark's
first and report second.
do first and report second. Yes, I learned that a long time ago myself, because I have a journalistic background as well, although
Right.
you and I never really got to discuss that a whole lot.
You did tell me though.
But
Yes.
yeah, but Mark, I really appreciate you coming on today. And I'm wondering if in the future, if maybe I could get you to come back and maybe speak in a little more detail on some of the things that we've touched on today, help educate my audience.
Of
Um,
course.
and I would love to keep going today. But little old man, my sick cat, he is at the vets, and they are like paging me. Are you going to come and pick him up? We need to have
Yeah, that's
consultation.
okay. No, we got to take care of the little man.
But I can't thank you enough. And it's really good to see you again.
You too, Susan. We've both been busy, and I kind of lost track. And I know you've been doing a lot of stuff with the animals, and I'm very proud of you and Bob, and because you guys have been through a lot. And I just very happy to know you and what you've been doing with animals and how you've stood up to, you branched out after having been Jehovah's Witness for a number of years. You branched out and flourished, and I just look back with happy times on having met you and
Yeah.
going to Heber Springs, and it's a place I would have never thought to visit, and I love visiting small towns and learning about other people, and I still have all of my pictures and everything from that visit there, and I went and saw the big dam and went to some waterfalls and things like that. Really enjoyed the visit. As terrible as the trial was, it was great meeting you and Bob and your kittens, and I hope we do this again.
Well, if we don't, it'll be your fault because I expect you to come back. So, anyway, thank you again. And I'm hoping maybe the next time that you would maybe be willing to take some questions from the viewers.
Oh yeah, I would. That would be
Okay.
fun. That would be fun. Maybe we can hear from some other people too and get their perspective on things, because I'm looking at it, from my focused perspective of having been a witness. But it's more important for us to hear from the community at large. And obviously, your community is outside of the Jehovah's Witness network. So it's really important to see the broad picture of what's important in life and how other people view what we're doing, and to kind of get a little perspective on it. So I'd love to do that.
All right. Awesome. Well, please give Kimmy my love. And one
Likewise.
last thing is I am using the photographs of your cats as thumbnails on my other channel. I don't know if you've seen them,
Oh, I want to see them. So,
but the pictures you sent, they are being
yeah,
used as thumbnails. So, all right, my friend, I
I've
love
got
you.
thousands more.
Send them, send
I
them.
will.
Please give
I
my
will.
love and my regards to Kimmy, your beautiful wife.
Likewise to you guys too. And great talking to you, Susan.
Okay, sweetie. I don't know how to kick you, so you're going to have to
Okay.
boot yourself.
I'll just jump off and leave studio. You have a good afternoon. Give some love to your cats, and it's nice interacting with some of your folks today and seeing their comments on the one side of my screen here. I know they're very they're really an intelligent bunch of folks that are watching what's going on. So
Yeah, they are.
thanks again.
Yeah, I got some
Alrighty.
real smart cookies over here. Okay, I love you. Bye bye.
Love to you as well. Bye bye.
There's so much more to open up and take out of that box. And I want to spend more time with you interacting with your chat after that interview. But those of you who aren't familiar with my cat rescue channel, Furry Feline Monsters of Mass Destruction, I have received a message that I need to go out to the vet's office for consultation to find out what's wrong with Willow now. So I know this is a very odd ending, a strange transition. I'm not going to sing you out today. It's been very triggering for me to remember the things that Mark has discussed with us today. Part of the triggering is I will never be able to see or know if they're okay because I am shunned. I'm proud that I am shunned. It's a badge of honor to have escaped this doomsday cult, their false teachings, and their evil practices. But the child sexual abuse within the Jehovah's Witness organization, as my friend Lloyd Evans has put it on his channel, is practiced on an industrial level. There are disciplinary actions and punishments that are taken towards those within the organization if they see something and say something. They are likely to lose their entire family. They are likely to be shunned, disfellowshipped, what's called soft shunning within the congregation. You're required to sit in the back room with the shades down and only listen because you violated the rules by reporting child sexual abuse outside of the organization. The issues are too deep and dark to ever, on this channel, to turn over and examine in great detail. But I can tell you there are ex-Jehovah's Witnesses channel, most namely the Lloyd Evans channel, where that leaf is turned over and over and over and over. People on social media who know what is going on and they're willing to speak up and do something about it. And I'm grateful that after almost 2 years of having this channel, that God and the universe have reminded me of part of my mission. Exposing the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania and New York I love you guys so much. Don't worry about my current emotional state. I'm fine. I'm holding it together so that I can drive to the vet, where I hope to get some good news. So I would tell you all to behave yourselves. You know what's coming. I would tell you all to behave yourselves, but why would I waste my breath and your time? We all know that you're not going to do it. So go have you some fun. But you stay safe while you're out there. And please learn, teach, and look for the universal hand sign. Thumb to the palm and 4 fingers over is telling you, help me. I'm being held against my will. Try to keep them in your line of sight. Call 911. Don't attract any attention to yourself and don't do anything. You could endanger the person that's doing this. But unlike those in the Jehovah's Witness organization, if you see something, say something. I'll see you guys on the flip-flop, whether you like it or not. That is, if you choose to tune in, dang nabbit. I love you guys. Thank you for being here. Hitting the broadcast.